I'll give you a thought right as we start, as we begin our time together, and that is this: that the stories we tell ourselves are true even if they're not true. The stories that we tell ourselves are true even if we're not true. This by the way, applies to like life advice. This isn't just something you could see on like an Instagram card or you could share with your teenager. You can, if you want. You could take it that way and share it that way. But it also applies to organizations. It's one of the most consistent things I've found with working with organizations in a variety of different aims, but innovation being one of them. Because the stories that we tell ourselves about how creativity in organizations happens, about how innovation happens, the stories we tell ourselves as an organization become true, even if they have no basis in reality, even if they're not actually how creativity works. And so I've made it one of my life's missions to help correct some of those stories, or to tell better stories, if you will. I often use the term myths to talk about some of these misconceptions. I use the term myths because myths are stories, usually very old stories or very entrenched stories. And they're stories that also reinforce social behavior or an organization's values. But if those myths aren't serving you anymore, it's time to update them. And so I want to use that as our structure for the time we have together today. I want to talk about some of the myths and misconceptions, some of the stories we might be telling ourselves about how creativity and innovation works that are actually blocking us from turning those ideas into action. I'm going to share 3 in particular, but I like to always put the most important one first. It's probably not what I'm supposed to do. I'm supposed to like build up to it, but let's just address the most important one first. The most important misconception that I've seen in a lot of organizations around innovation is this idea that innovation comes from creative individuals, that ideas are just the responsibility of this 1 or 2 really creative people in an organization. I mean, think of your historically creative, your groundbreaking innovations, and you'll almost always find the story is told about just one person, right? So we often talk about how Michelangelo painted the Sistine Chapel. What we don't talk about is that he needed about a dozen people to help him at various times, including sketching out some of the things that he would eventually paint and also going back over the things that he would paint, right? We just like to attribute it to that one person. Or we talk about the light bulb, right? I mean, if I asked you, think about it, sir, put an answer in your head, who invented the light bulb? You're probably going to tell me Thomas Edison. That one's actually not true for 2 reasons. The first is that depending on how you count the patents, Thomas Edison was either the 22nd or 23rd person to invent the light bulb. There were a number of other people who filed patents for electric light before him. In fact, his early patents were actually rejected for being too similar to those other patents. In fact, the first patent is actually called improvement in electric light because he had to be honest. He was building on the ideas of other people. But he was building on the ideas of other people in multiple different ways. One of the things we never talk about with someone like Edison is his facility in Menlo Park, New Jersey, and the presence of what were often referred to as the muckers, the people whose job it was to work in the facility with Edison and to work on a various number of different tasks. See, they found out pretty quickly from a marketing angle that the market would pay for this idea that it was Thomas Edison alone working on a company's problem. But in reality, there was about a dozen or so people who were working on various projects that, while the client believed were solely Edison's, were actually very rarely Edison. The interesting thing about the muckers, too, I'll just tell you this fun aside, is that they had this habit. I think the term muckers came from the fact that they were always mucking around in each other's projects. They were assigned to certain projects, but they couldn't help not help other people. And that actually led to some conflicts at times. So, for example, when the Menlo Park facility was purchased by Henry Ford and moved from New Jersey to Dearborn, Michigan, where it would be part of a museum, they were missing some parts. They set up the whole thing again to try and be this recreation, and they found that some of the machines that Edison and the muckers had invented were missing parts. And they freaked out, right? I mean, we lost some logistics thing here. We lost a crate. Something happened. We got to go back and find those missing parts. And it wasn't until the historians showed up and said, no, actually, that's okay, because the muckers believed that it was totally appropriate if you had a better need for that part in a different project to just go grab it, to just go steal it and use it in your own. And now you know, like muckers, it's like it's almost a curse word, but it's not. And now you know why they probably use that term. But I also love it because it was this idea that the teams were always rotating around. Pay attention to that one because that one is going to come back. It wasn't just Edison, it wasn't just past history, it's also things like computers. If we say who invented the computer, who invented the graphical user interface, Steve Jobs says it in his legendary commencement speech that Windows just copied the Mac. What he doesn't tell you is that Jobs also copied a different organization. We'll talk about that organization soon, but the other thing that we need to recognize is that we look at people like Michelangelo, Thomas Edison, or even modern day, we look at Steve Jobs and we forget the people behind them. Apple was founded between Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak. The iPhone, the legendary device that saved Apple, even the iPod, those were designed by Sir Johnny Ive and a team of various other designers. I like to think of it this way. When we think about innovation, groundbreaking, disruptive innovations, we usually forget the names behind that in favor of just a better story of just one name. If you are influential enough to put a dent in the universe, history books often forget all of the other people that got you up to critical mass to put that dent in the universe. And I think that is a really important implication, even for small scale innovations, even for just trying to get ideas implemented inside an organization. Because if we believe this myth, if we believe that ideas just come from solo creative people, then we do two things wrong. The first is we spend way too much time just trying to empower a small number of people that we've stamped with the creative approval stamp. The second, though, is that when those people struggle, they feel like they're failing. When you feel like you can't get traction on your ideas, when you feel like you can't find the right solution and you go for help, you feel like you're failing. But you're not failing. Because by asking for help, you're doing the same thing that Steve Jobs did. You're doing the same thing that Thomas Edison did. You're doing the same thing that innovators throughout history have done. Because the truth is that innovation is a team sport. It is not a solo endeavor. And if you feel like you're failing as an individual, it's probably because you're not getting enough help, because you're telling yourself this story that I should be able to push this through to approval by myself. No organization has ever really succeeded in scaling an innovation and really creating a disruptive change, either in the organization or in the market, without the support of a lot of different people. Innovation is a team sport. But here's what I think is interesting. That's not enough to just say, okay, everything has to be run by committee. You probably served on a few committees, right? You know that committees aren't exactly breeding grounds for innovation either. So what makes for that right kind of team? Well, this is where I think there's a fascinating study from about 10 years ago that sheds some light on the right kind of teams that perform in this idea that innovation is a team sport. Now, the study was done by two researchers, Brian Uzi and Jarrett Spiro, and it wasn't actually done in business. If you'll indulge me, it was done by studying Broadway musicals. I think it's a great breeding ground, and you'll see why. If you think about a Broadway musical, every musical you've ever seen, right? From Hamilton to Cats, I actually hope you haven't seen Cats, but if you have, from Hamilton to Cats, every Broadway musical, every big production has about 6 people on its senior leadership team. Producer, director, composer, lyricist, librettist. There's a quiz at the end, so you're going to have to memorize these. No, I'm kidding. There's no quiz. You just need to know that there are about 6. In almost every Broadway show, there are about 6. And the interesting thing is, sometimes those people are working on that senior leadership team of the show with people that they've worked with before. This was the insight that Uzi and Spiro wanted to study. You see, sometimes you had committees that kind of looked like this, right? So you had a couple people who'd worked together before. Maybe we're trying to make Cats 2 a thing. I don't know how you make a sequel of a musical that doesn't have a plot, but I digress, right? We're trying to get this thing off the ground, and we've got people who've worked together before and a couple new people, right? Most shows are like that. And what Uzi and Spiro sought to figure out was what's the right level of old friends, old colleagues, what I sometimes call sort of the band of brothers or the squad of sisters, right? That have worked together in the past that we know are successful and we can trust them. And what's the right level of new ideas, new people, new introductions, new diversity? And so what Uzi and Spiro did, and this was, by the way, before there was like IMDb or IMDb for Broadway shows, they actually had to collect the playbills of every show for about 80 years. And what they sought to do was create a model of the entire network of Broadway. Thankfully, it's kind of a small world, but they created a model of the entire network of Broadway in order to get at what the right level of diversity in any given year was. Diversity defined as new connections versus old connections. So you look at a situation like this, they would actually score the top one as a 1 on a scale of 1 to 5. Couple new interactions, but mostly Mostly a few people that have worked together, a couple new interactions, but not a lot of tightness. And a 5 would be the ultimate scenario where everyone has worked together with somebody before. It's a very, very tight network. This is the Band of Brothers sort of network. Now, they scored every single year in Broadway with a number between 1 and 5 to signify the level of density or diversity in that network. And then they correlated every year and every number with a level of success judged by how much money the shows made, how many different shows won various awards, right? If one show won all of the awards that year, then that actually wasn't a very creative year for the entire industry. So they looked at all of that, and then they tried to arrive at what the right level of new connections and old connections was. What's the right makeup of a team? So somewhere between 1 and 5 it fell. Go ahead. I want you to put a number in your head. What number do you think it'll be? And when I ask people to put this number in their head, I usually get one of 3 options, right? Some people say, oh, it's got to be 1s. It's got to be all new ideas, brand new people, etc. Some people go 5. Most people think it's a trick question, though, because most people think, oh, it's got to be 3, right? It's a trick question. It's all about balance. And that's sort of true. The right number is 2.6. 2.6 is the right level of density as judged by Uzi and Spiro. And if you're looking at that and you're going, wait a minute, this was truly a trick question, because how do you have 0.6 of a person? Then you actually have the same question I had when I read the study. And so I emailed Brian Uzi, one of the researchers, and I asked him, how do you have 0.6 of a person? And he wrote me back one of the most depressing things I've ever, because I'm an organizational psychologist. I'm supposed to know how to read all these studies. He wrote me back, you read the study wrong. And then he was kind enough to explain to me why I read the study wrong. See, what he said was that, yeah, you can't have 0.6 of a person. Remember that we came up with one number for the level of diversity for the whole network. You see, if you think about it as a team level, if your lesson is, oh, the right teams have 2.6, which would be still a majority of old connections and then those few new connections, it never stays that way. You see, let's assume you could have 0.6 and I guess 0.4 of a person, put them together and make this 2.6 team. The longer they work together, the more they will increase that number. They will eventually become 5. And this is probably the lesson for most organizations, where we define team as the people who respond to a certain manager or supervisor. We end up on the same team for a really long time, and we end up at teams of 5 often. And we know that's bad for ideas. But the lesson isn't just to mix it up. The lesson is to think about organizations as a network. Uzi and Spiro studied the entire network and how teams would form together, work on a project, and then disband. Some teams worked on projects that stayed together for years because it was a commercially successful show. Other teams worked together for a few months, and when the show couldn't even get funding, it was disappeared. They captured those as well. And that's the sort of messiness, but the key to success in this idea that innovation is a team sport, is that the best teams don't actually stay together for long. The way that I think about it is the best teams have diversity, but they have a renewable sense of diversity. Because we could assemble the absolute perfect mix of diversity at all levels, not just old and new connections, but the longer a team tends to work together, the more it starts to think alike, the more it has the same shared past experiences, and the more it'll come up with the same old ideas that end up being redundant. The longer a team stays together, the more likely you're going to hear stuff like, oh, well, we've never done it that way before. Or the more you're going to hear, oh, well, we tried that, but it didn't necessarily work. We know that innovation doesn't just come from a few creative individuals. We know that innovation is a team sport, but the best teams have this sense of renewable diversity. It's constantly refreshing. Now, I realize that's a tall challenge, so let's talk about a couple quick ways that you can at least renew the diversity on your teams a bit more often. The first is what I call rotate rosters, or what I sometimes call write the org chart in pencil. And this is probably the hardest one to implement, because it's the idea that let's have these teams stay together for a lot less often. Let's build project teams not just out of people that are reporting to the same manager or to the same director. Let's not even build them out of people that are in the same geographic space, which we tend to do. One of the weird opportunities we've had for the last year is that we all have practiced this virtual teams thing. We're all actually a lot better than we were at the beginning of 2020, collaborating with people that we don't share the same space as. And that can be a benefit to rotating out these rosters. If we need the best people for a certain project, we can now pull them from wherever they live and interact with them on that level and make sure that we're renewing them much more often. But I'll admit, rotating rosters is a bit disruptive, right? It can be a little annoying to have a new boss every 6 months, or to have 6 new bosses because I'm working on 6 different projects. So on a smaller scale, we could think about encouraging our employees to adopt what some organizations have called help time. This just means that at a certain point, at a certain percentage of your week, you have the opportunity to sit in on other teams' work, whether that's being a focus group or jumping into a brainstorming session or just giving another team feedback. It's not that 100% of the hours of your week are spent doing tasks that are assigned to you from your supervisor. It's that you have some freedom and autonomy to join other teams to provide your expertise. That doesn't rotate rosters nearly as much, but it does allow every team to benefit from an outside perspective from somebody they haven't worked with before. Even if all that person contributes is, well, hang on, explain that one to me again. And you have to explain it to a total newbie. You often think through it more and you arrive at a better conclusion. So you could think about ways that just the people that you're in charge of, just the people that are reporting to you or part of what you would call your team, lending them out to other teams inside the organization for help time will help not only your team, but a lot of other teams in the organization. And if you can't do that, if you can't rotate rosters, you can't even spare any help time, then at the very least, you can observe outsiders. You can study the way successful teams in a variety of different organizations do it. This could be by starting a book club in your own team of reading the biographies of successful sports teams or successful startup companies, whatever it takes to get an inside peek at how other teams and other industries are doing it is often enough just to seed your brain with a little bit of that different perspective. It's not going to be as effective as rotating rosters, treating the whole organization like a network of 2.6 teams, but it is going to help get your team back to that 2.6 level more often because they're able to introduce all of those new ideas. That's really the key to having this balance, is how can we have a team that works together enough to know what each other's knowledge, skills, and abilities are, to have structure and clarity on what their assignments are, but doesn't work together so much that they already know the ideas that everybody else in the team is going to have. You know, I wasn't planning on telling you this, but my wife and I have this running joke. Whenever one of us is in an argument with the other, notice how I said that. One of us is in an argument with the other, not we're in an argument. We usually try and resolve it or settle it by the fact that it's okay that we argue. Because if we agreed 100% of the time, then one of us would be unnecessary, and our couch is not all that comfortable, so I don't want to be sleeping on it, right? It's the same thing in organizations, minus the sleeping on the couch thing, although this is Couchella. Inside of organizations, if everyone on the team is coming up with the same ideas, then there's a couple people on the team that are redundant. And we don't want to make them redundant, but we do want to help them generate new ideas by observing outsiders, incorporating some level of help time, or if we can, rotating those rosters a bit more often. Now, this isn't the only myth we need to address if we're wanting to take ideas and turn them into action. Let's talk about another one, and this one has to do with how those teams that are generating a lot of different ideas deal with what is actually inevitable: friction. See, we have this misunderstanding that innovation is just fun and happy all of the time. You know, we read these profiles of startups or these incredibly creative companies, and all we ever hear about is the fun and the free food, right? The keg in the fridge or the cereal bar, etc. We hear stories like one of my favorites, if you've ever been to the headquarters of Pixar, you know, creators of the most successful film franchises of all time. They have a 20-foot tall replica of their famous Luxo Junior lamp outside their front door, right? So you walk underneath this lamp to come in. I mean, that looks like a fun place. They have this giant atrium where everybody interacts with each other. The atrium actually has like an all-you-can-eat every cereal you would want bar to go out to get food. It seems like a really fun and happy place. But if you're working on a project at Pixar, you're inevitably going to encounter friction, because friction is actually part of how they structure things. They have a regular recurring process where they're looking at the day's work. They actually call it dailies often, or shredding sessions. And they're seeking to honestly tear apart the work of each other in the service of making it a bit better. Not in a personal grudges, any of that, but in a task-focused way to point out the things that any given animator working on a film might have overlooked. They do this on a regular basis. They go frame by frame through a film in progress and point out what they think is wrong with it. But they've learned ways to keep that task focused. And I'm going to explain that way in a bit, but first, there's some real data behind what Pixar has discovered. You see, I think where this fun and happy thing comes from is this idea from Alex Osborne about the rules of brainstorming. You've probably heard these rules at some point, right? The chief rule in a brainstorming session is no idea is a bad idea, which I remember every time somebody in a brainstorming session inevitably offers a terrible idea. Because come on, some ideas are terrible. Let's just be honest, right? We adopted these rules, but we never really put them to the test. When they were put to the test, however, we found something a little bit different. So a number of years ago, a group of researchers put together two different groups, teams of teams, if you will, to test. Team one, all of the teams in the first condition had what you see above as the traditional rules of brainstorming, right? So deferred judgment, no idea is a bad idea. Quantity rules, just go for quantity. Freewheel, say whatever you want, build upon or combine each other's ideas. All of the teams in the second condition, they changed one key thing. Can you see it? It's that first rule. They actually put a little line in there. It was like a self-fulfilling prophecy of the research, if you will, that said, we find, or research has found, that the best teams actually push back when new ideas are introduced and have a time of deliberation before an idea gets written down as part of the team's brainstorming session. And they took all of these different teams in both of these different conditions and they set about a common challenge on two different continents. They asked them, how can we solve the traffic problem in San Francisco? Or they ran the study again in Paris, France. Right now, if you've been to either of those cities, you know that's a big problem. And no surprise, all of the teams came up with a lot of different ideas. But you probably know where this one is going. This is less of a tricky question than the 2.6. When it came time to tally up the ideas, the groups that were in the criticize ideas control, right, they dramatically outperformed the no idea is a bad idea. Because what they found is that when you push back on someone's idea and you do it in a respectful way, in a way that stays task focused, you invite that person to strengthen their idea. Then often you stumble into two or three other ideas that have a better chance of success. I think the most interesting thing about this study actually was that they had, in one version of it, they had a scribe write down all of the different ideas and then have to report to a different room in the building to deliver the paper that had all the ideas on it. And they asked all the scribes in both different conditions, they asked them, hey, on the way here, did you have any other ideas? And almost always in team one, the no idea is a bad idea group, the scribe would say, no, I think we came up with some great ideas in the room, and I'm just excited about what we came up with. And almost always in team two, they would say, you know, I actually did, because I was thinking about this idea that we discussed and debated, and I came up with this one. And often the people in the debate condition came up with two or three ideas just on the way to deliver their paper. They kept thinking about it. That's the power of that respectful dissent. You see, it's not that innovation is just fun and happy. It's that ideas need some level of conflict. They need some level of pushing back on them in order to strengthen them. I often say, sort of jokingly, that ideas, when they're first dreamed up, ideas are ugly babies, right? Okay, they're young, they need nurturing, and they're beautiful to the person that delivered them, right? But often to everybody else looking at them, I mean, there's a reason we have phrases like a face only a mother could love, right? And ideas are just like that. They need time to develop. They need time to be nurtured. And part of the way we nurture them is by seeking to strengthen them. And task-focused conflict is what strengthens them and nurtures them and develops them. You'll see this ugly baby concept coming up in the next idea as well. But let's talk about how you can actually strengthen those ideas. Couple different ideas for you. The first is what Pixar does. They call it plussing, and plussing steals itself from the world of improvisational comedy. One of the first rules, if you've ever taken an improv class, is no idea, right, is a bad idea. Always be saying yes and, sometimes called always accept an offer. The idea is you don't shove rejection at people when they're trying to come up with what we're acting out as the improvisational act. You just say yes and, even if you want to pivot it. So even if you want to disagree with someone, in the case of plussing, you have to add something that they can build off of. You have to give your criticism plus something else. So if you think about this, like let's think about this in the realm of Pixar. Plussing would look like, let's say we're doing the dailies, we're shredding apart Toy Story. What are we up to now? 7, 8, 9? I don't even know. We're working on Toy Story 5, and we say, I don't like the way Woody's eyes look in this frame. That's a criticism, but I still owe them a plus. So I have to give them a suggestion on how they can improve upon the criticism I pointed out. So I could say something like, we need to narrow the corners of his eyes and tilt them up a bit because he's supposed to be smiling. He's supposed to be happy, but he actually just looks inauthentic the way we've animated his eyes here. You see, that's the plus. That's the offer that we're giving them. And the rule with plussing specific to Pixar is that you can give any criticism, you have to give a plus, and ultimately it's on the animator, the person responsible for that project. It's on them whether or not to accept or reject that criticism. But at least now you're not just vetching. Now you're not just criticizing for the sake of criticizing. You're saying, I care so much about the success of this project that I can't help but point out this thing I think is wrong. And I'm going to give you some way that we could work together to improve it. Now, a little caveat here. I already told you about my wife once. Might as well tell you about this story as well. Once I finished writing the book where I talked about Pixar and I talked about plussing, etc., I found I had a lot more trouble complaining even at home. So maybe don't share plussing with your spouse or partner or somebody that you live with, because anytime I would complain for like a year after she read the book, she would just stand there and nod. And I would say, what are you looking at me for? She'd go, oh, I'm waiting for the plus. You owe me a plus. You criticized, you owe me a plus. So maybe, no, I'm kidding. It actually works really, really well there. But it sends this idea, again, that it's okay to criticize. The way to keep it task focused is to make sure you add that suggestion for how we could improve it so that A, people don't take it as personally, but B, they know what to do with that criticism. So that's plussing. Another way that we could work on this is the devil's advocate approach. And what I don't mean here is that just that super negative person that sits in meetings and goes, well, to play devil's advocate here, I don't mean that. If you look at the history of the actual use of the devil's advocate, it was used, ironically, it was used by the Catholic Church in discussions about who among their priests and holy people should become saints, who should be elevated to the level of saint. Whenever there was a discussion about who should be sainted, they would always appoint a devil's advocate. In other words, a person whose job it was to vet that person, to find all of the criticism they could, all of the reasons why that person should not be a saint. That person was sometimes called the devil's advocate. Other times, they were called the defender of the faith. In other words, we want to make sure that we're making the right decision. And so we need to have someone's specific role and designated role be to point out the flaws in our thinking. That's what I mean when I say devil's advocate. Going into a discussion, going into a brainstorming session and saying, you know what, it's your job in this meeting to be the one pointing out the flaws in our thinking. That's devil's advocate. And when you do it that way, people don't take offense. When you do it that way, it's not the same negative person all the time. You can remind that person that you did not assign him to be the devil's advocate this time around. It has to be that structured, designated person. If you want to take it to a whole other level, you could do the last way you could leverage conflict in a team, that is by applying what's sometimes called red teams. Red teams from the world of war games where we have two different strategies. You could actually say, we're working on this project, but why don't you two or three go over and say, what are all the ways this project could fail? Or if we were our competitor and we knew we started this, how would we compete with it? How would we respond to this new initiative that we're looking to implement? And the idea is you actually war game out the competitive response with a few designated people who come to you usually with conflict that you've never even thought of, because it's their job to adopt the mindset of somebody outside the organization. And as a result, they do. And as long as that conflict stays task focused, we arrive at better ideas. We arrive at ideas that were pushed back on and grew up as a result of that friction. Ideas and muscles work the exact same way. When you put them under stress, they usually grow to something a lot better. So if we have this idea that innovation is always fun and happy as a myth, and we know that the truth is that innovation needs conflict, our yes and to this one is that the best teams, the most creative teams, leverage respectful dissent and have leaders who teach their people the ground rules for how we debate. Ground rules like plussing, ground rules like only the devil's advocate can be it, or ground rules like just watching the way people are phrasing things and making sure that they're actually pushing back on the idea in a respectful way. In fact, let's talk about that respectful way, because this can be the really hard thing as leaders. As leaders, it's our job to criticize ideas. People come to us and say, I want to initiate this, or I'm working on this project, etc. They come to us with those ugly babies, right? They present them to us and say, bless this ugly baby for me. And you're like, okay, I don't know that I can do that, right? And there's this really interesting myth that goes alongside that. We, as leaders especially, often end up pushing back on an idea, which is important, but pushing back on an idea in a way that squelches creativity out of a mistaken belief that we can recognize great ideas. That's actually the last thing I want to point out here. We often think in organizations that innovation is an idea problem, that our biggest challenge is coming up with lots of different ideas. But what we don't consider is that it's our job to judge those ideas, to figure out which ideas we want to actually test, which ideas we want to develop. And our response to that determines how often people come to us with the next ugly baby. This is all based on this belief that we can recognize great ideas as the arbiters of truth for the organization, as team leaders, that we can recognize the good ideas from the bad ideas. And that's not actually true. It turns out that we as humans are terrible at judging great ideas. Business history is full of these. I mentioned earlier the graphical user interface invented by Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak. No, just kidding. It was actually invented by Xerox. The Xerox Alto, the company at Zero, the Palo Alto research facility, developed the first graphical user interface, the first computer that used the metaphor of a desktop and windows and folders and the whole thing. That was developed at Xerox. Xerox was just in the photocopying business. And so when the technology was presented to senior leaders, they said, what does this have to do with photocopying, right? This has nothing to do with it. Now, thankfully, they've realized that they're actually a document company, not just a paper photocopying company. But at the time, they did not. And they allowed another company to come in and swoop that technology away. In fact, for all of the flack that I've thrown at Steve Jobs, I'll throw one more, which is that once Jobs confronted Bill Gates about the idea that Windows just copied the Mac, that he stole the whole concept for Windows from Macintosh computers. And Bill Gates, in his wisdom, answered back, I don't look at it that way, Steve. I look at it like I broke into our neighbor's Xerox house and found that you had already stolen the TV, right? Because Xerox was challenged with recognizing this great idea, and they didn't. And it's not just Xerox. Kodak invented the digital camera. This is a picture of the very first digital camera ever invented. And by the way, it was terrible, right? It was like less than a quarter of a megapixel. It took a very blurry picture. It took a massive amount of space. At the time, what was considered a massive amount of space. It was nowhere near the quality of a film camera. And so Xerox executives, who had never heard of the ugly baby principle, they just very wisely said, well, I don't think there's any future here. And they allowed other companies who had a background in technology and knew that it would compound. They allowed other companies to develop it. They invented the device that led to their bankruptcy because they thought that innovation is just this idea problem, that it's just about getting more people to have more ideas and we'll just judge them all and we'll find the ones that work best and we'll just implement those. But innovation's not an idea problem. You see, for an idea to be recognized as innovation, for it to be recognized as something truly disruptive, it has to satisfy two qualities. This is what we're thinking of every time someone presents us an idea, an ugly baby, whatever it is. An idea has to be novel and useful for it to be creative, or any synonym of those. If you look at the research on creativity, it almost always has some synonym of these two words. It has to be new, has to be original, has to depart from the status quo, and it has to be useful or valuable. It has to be easy to see how it's going to create more value than it costs. But it turns out we as humans, we have a terrible job recognizing this. We certainly can see the new whenever one of these things is presented to us. We certainly see how it's different. We certainly see how it's kind of out there, right? And when we say things like, oh, that won't work because, or we say things like we tried something similar and it didn't work, we're seeing a lot of the newness and the originality, but the usefulness is fuzzy. And there's a very good reason for that. For an idea to be an innovation, we're asking it to depart from the status quo. But what do we use to judge whether an idea is useful? We use the status quo. We use past experience. We use the current business that we're in. So we're asking ideas. We're asking our people to give us ideas that depart from the status quo. And the only thing we're using is the status quo to judge whether or not those ideas are useful. That's the second element of the ugly babies idea. Right? It's that it needs time to nurture and develop. And when we just go quick to judge, when we assume innovation is an idea problem, the more ideas we get, the better off we'll be. And we don't give lots of different ideas time to develop. We end up with two things. We end up first falsely judging ideas like the graphical user interface or like the digital camera, but we end up with a team of people who don't feel free to bring us that next idea as well. It's not that innovation is an idea problem. Innovation is a recognition problem. Innovation requires not just people to come up with ideas, but leaders and teams who are willing to recognize ideas for their potential and then invest in them and develop them, suspend judgment to some extent, invite ways in which those ideas can be tested and grow so that we can find out whether or not there's something here or whether we were right all along. And how we handle that has a dramatic effect on the culture and the social environment and whether or not people bring us ideas in the future. So how do we do that? A couple ideas for you around how we can better recognize ideas and give them space to develop, that we can give them time to figure out whether or not these ideas really are innovations. The first idea is just to invite other people in to judge and invite peers in to judge our ideas with us. You see, when somebody comes to you with an idea and you just say, oh, it sounds like it might not work because of this, or it sounds like, or we did something like that before, you're giving judgment too fast, but you're also not inviting the other person into it. As a result, they might not feel heard. They might not feel actually considered. So instead of that, whenever somebody presents an idea, big or small, right? I want to dramatically pivot our whole operation to this, or like, hey, I think the party should be on Thursday. Whenever somebody comes to you with an idea and you disagree, you have a little bit of judgment in it, don't just express what that is. Don't question the idea. Question the assumptions behind the idea, right? So you could say something like, instead of saying, oh, X will never work, say, it sounds like in X you're assuming Y. Do we know that Y is true? And if you don't know what the assumptions are, you can even just ask them. One of the smartest questions that I've ever been taught to ask when people present me ideas is, what would have to be true for this idea to work? What would have to be true for this idea to work? That's not an expression of judgment. It's an invitation to help the other person come up with the very criteria by which we're going to judge this idea. And then usually you can just test those assumptions without any real investment in cost. You can test those assumptions, find out if we're in the right ballpark, and if it's worth investing some money to test further, or if the assumptions, if what would have to be true in order for the idea to work turns out to not be true, then you end up saving a lot of time and money, but you've invited that person in so they feel safe to come to you with that next idea. Now, the next thing you can do is figure out how to prototype what's possible. You might not be able to come up with a mass scale prototype of everything, but is there a way that you can develop a test to see, right? This is what a question like, what would have to be true for this idea to work? This is what a question like that does. It's trying to figure out what are the things we could test, and is the solution to that a prototype? One of my favorite versions of this sort of democratizing innovation and prototyping what's possible is a program that Adobe came up with a number of years ago. They called it the Kickbox. And the idea went, rather than spend another $1 million to just a few people in R&D, let's actually carve up some of that money into what they call the Kickbox. You could kickstart any test for an idea. So you would request a Kickbox and it would come with some prototyping materials. It came with some coffee and some chocolate, because you're going to need both of those when you're trying to work on tests and ideas. But it also came up with instructions on how to run a decent test or a decent prototype. And it came with a $1,000 prepaid gift card to spend on that test. And you could do that by, buying paid ads on the internet that are testing two different variations of a color and just seeing, do people like this one more than that one? You could invest it in finding survey research or paying another organization to find that survey research. Whatever your idea was, you had a plan for testing it, and you had a little bit of funds. And the rule was, you could spend those funds on whatever test you come up with, but you have to share with the rest of us what you learned from that test. And I love this idea for two reasons. I share this idea for two reasons. One, it again observes the first principle, which is invites other people to defer judgment and to be a part of the judgment together. But two, it actually very clearly answers the question of how much does all of this cost, right? Because you can only lose a set amount of money. You could only actually lose the amount of money in that Kickbox before you realize, no, okay, there's not really a future in this idea. You don't end up with a few charismatic people in the organization persuading us to invest millions of dollars in an idea that'll never work. You find out the truly ugly babies and the ugly babies with potential really, really quickly. So think about the ideas that you're trying to turn into action and see, can we scale that down and just do a small scale prototype of what's possible right now on a limited budget, and then share our learnings with everybody. Now, the last thing we do, I already sort of hinted at this, but I actually love to ask this question in the actual brainstorming session. What would have to be true? Before we generate any ideas, We ask what would have to be true for this idea to work, or what would have to be true for our program to be successful before we jump in. This is contra to Alex Osborne, but you've seen all of the research around criticism and around respectful dissent already. If you put that in ahead of time and you actually brainstorm the rules for what our solution has to abide by, then you end up having a much easier time picking the ideas you actually want to invest in. So before you just think, oh, I understand the problem, let's jump in as a team with a brainstorming session and generate a lot of different ideas, or before you think about an idea you listened to today or in the past couple of days and go, yes, let's implement that, stop, pull back and go, how do we know this is actually going to be successful? Let's actually do that ahead of time as a team together. Let's generate that. The side note here, what I find is that when you ask this question, you also get all those super negative people that like to play devil's advocate, but you're deliberately not appointing them as devil's advocate. You get them to feel like they really participated because they participated in the act of complaining about limitations and budgets and all that sort of stuff. And you did it before it was time to generate any ideas. So there's a number of different places we can play this, what would have to be true for this idea to work. And it's important to do that. You know, I work with organizations across a variety of different industries across the entire world. And this idea problem thing is something that comes up often. I work with so many organizations that invite me in and go, we want our people to have more creative ideas. We want to be able to implement more of these ideas. We want to scale innovation. We just don't have the ideas. And the truth is, ideas, it's not an idea problem. We don't actually need it, right? Innovation is a recognition problem, and the best teams give ideas time to grow. We don't need more creative ideas. We need to get better at recognizing and developing the creative ideas we already had. This whole conference is a celebration of ideas. And so if you're like me, you're probably at the end of this overwhelmed with ideas. So you probably believe me on this first thing now, right? That we don't need more creative ideas. Wow, listen to what we put together. Think about all of the great ideas we put together. We've got all of the ideas we need. What we need is a better system for recognizing them, nurturing and developing them, and incorporating more people, a renewable diversity in, so that we can implement more of those ideas. We know there are a lot of stories that we're telling ourselves that are true even when they're not true. We know there are a lot of things that are blocking our ability to turn ideas into action. And today we've shared just 3 really important ones. We know that the truth is not that it's a few creative people. We know that innovation is a team sport. We know that it's not supposed to be fun and happy. And so when there is conflict, it doesn't mean we're doing it wrong. It means we need to leverage respectful dissent to make those ideas better. But in doing so, we also need to give ideas time to develop. That's part of what the conflict process does. We need to defer judgment and see how many people we can include in the process of creating this metric for whether or not these ideas have merit, instead of just deciding for ourselves as team leaders or deferring up the hierarchy of no to let somebody else decide for us. We don't need more creative ideas. We need to give ideas time to develop, and we need a system where we can grow them from ugly babies into something truly beautiful. And that's my big challenge for you at the end of this whole week. You've heard an idea or two that you think has some merit. How can we make it a team sport? How can we leverage respectful dissent? And how can we set up a system that grows it from an ugly baby into something truly beautiful, into an idea that's actually worth making happen, and an idea that creates a tremendous amount of value? I know one thing for certain though, and that's that you will not be able to do it alone. Innovation is a team sport. So as you think about all the ideas you've heard in this whole week, start with who are the people I need on my team to help make this idea truly happen. Thank you so much for having me as a part of this. I hope I haven't overwhelmed you with ways we can turn it into action. Pick that one and get going, because it's not about just recognizing ideas. It's about turning them into action, and we do that together.